A millionaire traded loyalty for glamour, abandoning his pregnant wife for a stunning model. But years later, a letter, a courtroom, and a hidden child pull him into a truth that ruins everything he built. When a secret unravels, so does his freedom, because not even a millionaire can outrun consequences forever. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the marble floors of the Grand Marlowe Hall. It was the kind of place where the wealthy gathered not just to celebrate, but to be seen, where champagne flowed like water, and the scent of power lingered in the air just as much as expensive cologne. Standing at the center of it all, surrounded by high-profile investors and socialites, was Adrian Blake, every inch the image of a millionaire living his best life. Tailored navy suit, a Rolex peeking from beneath his cuff, that perfectly rehearsed smirk he reserved for cameras and crowds alike. He was magnetic, and he knew it. When he laughed, people leaned in. When he paused, they waited. He didn't just walk into a room, he owned it. By his side stood his wife, Emma, quiet, graceful, radiant in a soft emerald gown that hugged her gently swollen belly. She didn't sparkle the way Adrian's guests did. There were no bold jewels, no designer clutch, no loud voice slicing through the air. Instead, there was warmth in her eyes, the kind of calm presence that offered comfort rather than competition. But in a room full of noise and glitter, she went unnoticed by most, except by Adrian, who barely looked at her at all. He was too busy holding court, laughing a little too loud at jokes that weren't funny, exchanging glances with younger women who wore ambition like perfume. There was one in particular, Sienna. She wore red like it was armor, her blonde hair cascading in soft waves over one shoulder, her eyes scanning the room like she already knew how to win it. She moved through the gala with effortless confidence, whispering to investors, flashing the perfect smile at photographers. And every time her eyes met Adrian's, they lingered just a second too long. Emma noticed. Of course she did. She wasn't naive. She watched as Adrian slowly drifted from her side over the course of the evening, caught in Sienna's orbit like a moth to flame. At one point, she placed her hand gently on her belly, as if trying to anchor herself to something real while the man she loved disappeared right before her eyes. Later that night, in the privacy of their penthouse, Emma tried to speak. "You seemed distant tonight," she said quietly, as she removed her earrings and placed them on the velvet-lined tray. Adrian didn't look up from his phone. "Just business. Nothing to worry about." "You barely looked at me," she said, her voice steady but sad. He sighed, finally setting his phone down. "Emma, not everything is about you. You know these events are important. I need to network. That's how I keep this lifestyle going." Emma nodded, but something inside her shifted. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just turned away and walked into the bedroom, the soft click of the door a subtle declaration of pain. But for Adrian, guilt was fleeting. In his world, feelings were distractions. And Sienna was anything but a distraction. She was a temptation. She was the embodiment of everything Adrian thought he deserved: glamour, youth, attention. A few weeks after the gala, Adrian began seeing her more often under the guise of business meetings. Sienna knew exactly what she was doing. Her compliments were timed, her touch accidental, her laughter deliberate. It wasn't long before whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into truths. Emma found out when she walked into his office late one evening, a printed email still warm in her hand. "Dinner reservations for two at Latelier? Champagne suite at the Ashford Grand?" she asked, her voice calm, though her eyes betrayed her. Adrian looked at her like a child caught in a lie but too arrogant to admit it. "It's not what you think. You don't even care enough to lie properly," she said. Her eyes watered, but her voice remained unwavering. "You have a family, Adrian. Or at least you were supposed to." He didn't apologize. Not sincerely. He said all the things men like him say when cornered. "It's complicated. You don't understand. I need something more. Something exciting. I'm not ready to settle into domesticity." She held her belly then, a protective gesture that broke his composure for a second, but only a second. "You're a coward," she whispered, "and you'll regret this." But he didn't believe her. Not then. The next day, he packed a bag and moved into Sienna's high-rise apartment, leaving Emma alone in the penthouse that once felt like home. He didn't even have the decency to make the break clean. He texted her later, saying they should talk like adults and keep things civil for the baby's sake. Emma didn't respond. In Sienna's world, Everything was sharp and seductive. Crystal glasses, white marble countertops, curated furniture that looked like it belonged in a gallery. But no amount of sleek decor could cover the cracks. The chemistry that once felt intoxicating quickly faded into discomfort. Sienna wasn't interested in domesticity either. She liked parties, brand deals, red carpet galas. She didn't want to build a life. She wanted to build a brand. Adrian tried to fit in. He hosted influencer dinners, posed for social media photos, gave interviews that masked the mess behind the scenes. But behind closed doors, the silence between him and Sienna grew louder. Conversations became arguments. Passion became obligation. Her compliments turned into criticisms. And for the first time in a long time, Adrian began to feel something he rarely allowed himself to feel: regret. One night, after a particularly tense evening, he stood on the balcony overlooking the city. He lit a cigar, watched the lights flicker in the distance, and thought about Emma. He tried to remember the last time he actually looked at her, not just glanced, but really saw her. He couldn't. He tried to imagine the sound of her laughter, but it was drowned by the noise of his own selfishness. Behind him, Sienna was yelling at her assistant over a misplaced bag. Adrian didn't even flinch. His world was glamorous now, just like he wanted. But somewhere, in the quiet ache of night, he started to realize that glamour had a cost. And maybe, just maybe, he had paid with something he couldn't get back. The next morning, Adrian received a letter. It was simple, no logos, no dramatic stamps. Just a name and an address. He stared at it for a moment before tossing it into the drawer. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was probably nothing. But something about that letter unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. Because no matter how high you climb, the past never really disappears. It just waits, quietly, patiently, until it's ready to return. And it always returns. If you were in Emma's place, what would you have done? Would you fight, forgive, or walk away? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us. How would you rate this story so far, from 0 to 10? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Adrian woke up to sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sienna's penthouse, but there was nothing warm about the morning. The sleek marble floors felt cold beneath his feet, and the silence in the apartment was heavy. Sienna had already left for a photo shoot, or maybe brunch with one of her fashion friends. He had stopped keeping track. She came and went like a storm, swirling in and out of his life with perfect hair, perfect clothes, and perfectly rehearsed affection. At first, it had thrilled him. The energy, the spontaneity, the sheer unpredictability of her. But now, it was wearing thin. The chaos that once felt like escape now felt like noise, a constant buzzing that never let him breathe. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat alone at the oversized kitchen island, scrolling through unread messages and half-hearted business updates. The silence of the morning gnawed at him. There was no gentle humming of a woman making breakfast, no soft voice asking how he wanted his eggs, no warmth. Just emptiness dressed in expensive furniture. The press had been relentless in painting the new couple as a glamorous success story. Social media influencers reposted their photos, articles dubbed them the power pair of modern luxury, and tabloids splashed headlines about their extravagant vacations and lavish gifts. Adrian and Sienna smiled for cameras, held hands on red carpets, and laughed at charity galas. But beneath the surface, the cracks were deepening. Sienna wasn't interested in Adrian's past, his achievements, his childhood, his fears. She didn't ask questions that required depth. She wanted front-row seats at Fashion Week and rooftop parties with champagne fountains. And Adrian, once so confident in his world of numbers and boardrooms, found himself drifting. Conversations with Sienna were shallow and brief. Arguments sparked over trivial things, too much time on the phone, too little praise for her outfit, a forgotten anniversary of their first weekend getaway. He noticed how quickly her affection turned into irritation, how she pulled away when things weren't exciting enough. She wanted the illusion of love, not the weight of commitment. Meanwhile, in a much smaller apartment across town, Emma lived a different reality. Her pregnancy had progressed quietly, without photographers documenting every step, without luxury baby showers or designer nurseries. She worked part-time at a small bookstore, took prenatal yoga classes, and walked home through quiet streets where no one whispered about betrayal. Her world was simple, and perhaps, in some ways, lonely, but it was hers. She decorated the nursery alone, painting tiny stars on the walls and folding soft baby clothes into drawers. She didn't cry at night, not anymore. She read books about motherhood, talked to her belly, and wrote letters she never intended to send. Letters to Adrian, to their unborn child, to herself. Letters filled with hope, anger, confusion, and strength. She had every reason to hate him, but she didn't let that poison her heart. She focused on building a world where love wasn't something you had to beg for. She stopped wondering if he would come back. Instead, she prepared herself to face life without him. And in doing so, she became stronger than she ever thought possible. Adrian, however, couldn't escape the growing weight of dissatisfaction. One afternoon, while Sienna was at a brand collaboration event, he wandered into an old part of town. He didn't know why. Maybe nostalgia, maybe guilt, maybe both. He found himself in front of a small cafe he hadn't visited in years. He sat at a corner table, ordered a coffee, and stared out the window. Across the street was a toy store. He watched a young couple walk out, laughing, the woman holding a teddy bear against her belly. Adrian couldn't look away. He remembered the day Emma told him she was pregnant. He hadn't reacted with joy. He had smiled, hugged her, said the right things, but inside, he'd already been calculating how it would affect his schedule, his brand, his freedom. And now, sitting alone in that cafe, he realized how much he had taken for granted. When he returned home that evening, Sienna was hosting a cocktail mixer. The apartment was filled with influencers and brand reps, all speaking in rehearsed sound bites and chasing photos for clout. Adrian stood in the corner with a drink in his hand, watching Sienna flirt with a fashion photographer who looked half his age. No one noticed him. No one cared who he was beneath the suit. They liked his money, his name, his apartment. But not him. Not really. He excused himself quietly and went out onto the balcony. The city stretched endlessly before him, glittering and loud. But it didn't feel like his anymore. It felt borrowed, and he was starting to question if he had ever truly belonged in it. A few days later, Adrian received another letter. This one wasn't just a name and address. It was from a law firm. He opened it casually, expecting some business formality, but his heart sank as he read the content. It was a notice, a formal document informing him of an impending legal process. No details, no explanations, just a date and a location. He crumpled it in his hand and threw it into the trash, pretending it didn't shake him. But it did. Something about the cold, formal tone unsettled him more than he admitted. He didn't tell Sienna. He told no one. But it haunted him. Sienna noticed the change. "You've been moody lately," she said one evening as she lounged on the sofa in a silk robe. "Is something wrong at work?" "No," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." "You're not fun anymore," she said bluntly. "I miss the man who used to surprise me with trips and gifts, not sit around sulking like a bored accountant." Adrian didn't respond. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in a while. She was stunning, undeniably so. But there was something hollow in her eyes. He wondered if she ever really saw him either, or just the version of him that fit her image. That night, as he lay in bed next to a woman who had once seemed like a fantasy, he realized he felt lonelier than he had ever felt with Emma. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he felt peace. It wasn't at a gala or a private jet. It was a rainy afternoon, curled up on the couch with Emma, her head on his shoulder, talking about names for their baby. He hadn't thought about that moment in months. But now it felt like a memory he didn't deserve. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a question began to form. A question he couldn't silence no matter how hard he tried. What if I made the biggest mistake of my life? That thought echoed in his mind as he drifted into sleep. Outside, the city lights flickered. Somewhere in that same city, Emma was reading a bedtime story aloud, resting her hand on her belly, whispering goodnight to a child whose father had traded loyalty for glamour. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Something was coming. Something neither of them could see. And it would change everything. The hospital room was small, modest, and dimly lit. The walls were painted in soft pastel shades meant to soothe, but nothing about the moment felt calm. Emma gripped the side rails of the bed, her face damp with sweat and emotion. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes remained fixed ahead with a kind of fierce focus. There was no one waiting anxiously outside the door. No flowers delivered. No husband pacing nervously in the hallway. Just her and the sound of a heartbeat monitor steadily reminding her of the life she was about to bring into the world. The nurse spoke in a gentle tone, encouraging her through the final push. And then, as dawn broke, a baby's first cry echoed in the room. Soft at first, then louder, stronger, like it knew it had arrived in a world already full of complexity. Emma's eyes welled with tears as the nurse placed the baby on her chest. A boy, warm, fragile, and utterly perfect. She whispered his name like a prayer, one she had chosen weeks before but never shared with anyone. Not even Adrian. Especially not Adrian. After a while, the nurse took the baby to clean and weigh him. Emma watched, her body exhausted but her mind racing. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, where she imagined Adrian standing beside her, holding their son, marveling at him the way she was. But that moment dissolved as quickly as it came. He wasn't there. He hadn't asked. He hadn't called. She hadn't told him. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she no longer knew if he deserved to know. In the months since he left, she had come to terms with a cruel truth. He had chosen glamour over loyalty, fantasy over reality, and image over substance. He had walked away from more than just a marriage. He had walked away from a future he didn't even take the time to understand. Days turned into weeks, and Emma adjusted to life as a single mother. She moved into a small rental closer to the bookstore where she worked, juggling baby bottles and diaper changes with shifts behind the register. Her days were full of chaos, love, exhaustion, and resilience. Her nights were quiet but rarely lonely. She held her son in her arms and read him stories from old novels, whispering words of magic and courage into his dreams. And as she rocked him to sleep, she sometimes wondered if he would ever know his father, not just by name, but by presence, by voice, by love. She questioned herself at times, wondered if she was being unfair. But then she remembered the way Adrian had walked away, the way he never looked back, the way he traded a family for a facade. Life moved forward, slowly but steadily. Emma found support in small places. A kind neighbor who helped with groceries, a retired teacher from the bookstore who offered to babysit, a local parenting group where she met women who had stories just as heavy as hers. She didn't share much about her past. She didn't need pity or attention. She just needed space to heal and a future to build. And she was doing just that, one quiet day at a time. Unbeknownst to her, in a towering office downtown, a young lawyer named Daniel Morgan was reviewing a set of confidential documents. He was fresh out of law school, eager to prove himself in a firm known for high-stakes litigation. But something about this file was different. It had been marked urgent, passed directly from a senior partner with very little explanation. Inside were legal briefs, case summaries, and one particular document that caught Daniel's attention. A guardianship clause tied to a business account under Adrian Blake's name. Curious, he dug deeper. He wasn't supposed to ask questions, but something about the unusual confidentiality struck him as odd. Why would a financial account have a clause tied to an unidentified minor? And why did it link back to a woman named Emma Caldwell, her name barely legible in old correspondence logs? Daniel flagged it for review, unaware that this small discovery would be the first crack in a much larger storm. Meanwhile, Adrian continued living in his world of curated perfection. Sienna had launched her own skincare brand, and most of their time was now spent managing her public image. Adrian became less a partner and more a prop, posing for campaign photos and drafting scripted interviews. His role was to smile, speak in polished sound bites, and keep the illusion alive. But behind closed doors, their relationship had become a transaction. They barely touched. They barely spoke. And when they did, it often ended in passive-aggressive remarks or icy silence. Adrian began avoiding home, spending late hours in his office staring at spreadsheets he no longer cared about, drinking scotch and remembering things he wished he could forget. He thought about Emma often, but always pushed the thoughts away, convincing himself there was no point. He had made his choice. What good would it do to revisit the past? But the past wasn't done with him. It was quietly unraveling in the background, threads being pulled one by one, forming a pattern he couldn't yet see. Daniel Morgan, now more intrigued than ever, continued investigating the guardianship clause. He discovered that the account in question had been used to mask several off-book transactions over the past 3 years, money diverted from Adrian's companies into shell funds, and then tied to names that didn't match any employee or family records. It was subtle, hidden beneath layers of legal jargon, but clear enough to raise concern. He took it to his supervisor, who dismissed it as a minor error. But Daniel wasn't convinced. Something didn't add up. He began compiling evidence, documenting timelines, creating a case file, not because he was trying to expose anyone, but because his instincts told him this wasn't just an accounting mistake. It was fraud. Back in her quiet apartment, Emma received an unexpected visit from an old friend, Mariah, a lawyer she hadn't seen since college. They talked over coffee, catching up on life, motherhood, and heartbreak. But as the conversation deepened, Mariah grew serious. "Emma," she said softly, "I need to tell you something. A colleague of mine came across a document. Your name was on it. And it's connected to Adrian." Emma froze. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. "What kind of document?" she asked, her voice cautious. Mariah hesitated before answering. "A guardianship clause, tied to a financial account under his name. I don't know the full scope yet, but it looks suspicious. I think it's time you talk to a legal advisor." Emma's world tilted slightly. For months, she had kept her life quiet, low profile, separate from Adrian's. She had never filed for child support. She hadn't listed his name on the birth certificate. She had built her own path, determined not to depend on a man who had once chosen glamour over loyalty. But now, it seemed that no matter how far she had gone, his choices were beginning to seep into her world again. And this time, she wouldn't be silent. She owed that much to her son. That night, after putting the baby to sleep, Emma sat alone at the kitchen table, the letter Mariah had brought lying open in front of her. She stared at the document, her mind reeling. She didn't know what Adrian had done, but something told her it was serious. And she also knew one thing with certainty. He would never be the one to come clean. He never had been. But maybe this time, the truth wouldn't wait for his permission. Maybe it was finally time for the past to speak louder than his money ever could. And far across the city, Adrian lay awake, unable to sleep. That same weight in his chest had returned. The one he had tried to silence with money, women, luxury, and denial. He didn't know why, but something told him things were about to change. He just didn't know how soon. The invitation was printed on pearl-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering and wrapped in silk ribbon. It was for yet another high-profile gala, this time hosted by one of Sienna's brand sponsors at an exclusive rooftop venue. The dress code was black tie glam, and Adrian stood in front of the mirror in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, adjusting his cufflinks with mechanical precision. He no longer felt excitement for these events. It was just routine now, another chance to parade their image for cameras, another stage to keep the illusion alive. Behind him, Sienna twirled in a shimmering gown, her reflection beaming back at her. She tossed a glance at Adrian. "You could at least pretend to enjoy this," she said, applying a final stroke of lipstick. Adrian gave a half smile, the same kind he'd given 1,000 times before. "I'm here, aren't I?" he replied, but even his own voice sounded distant. The evening was a blur of flashing lights, clinking glasses, and hollow conversations. Everyone wanted something, an endorsement, a photo, a connection. Sienna was in her element, posing for pictures, laughing too loudly, making sure her face appeared on every media feed before midnight. Adrian played his part, but with every compliment, every forced conversation, he felt the weight of a world that was no longer his. He was drifting further from everything that had once grounded him. Purpose, clarity, identity. The glamorous lifestyle he had once craved now felt like a mask he couldn't take off. Underneath, he felt tired, hollow, and increasingly aware that none of it meant anything. At the firm, whispers had begun. Executives noticed discrepancies in budgets. There were meetings held without him, projects quietly reassigned. Adrian shrugged it off at first. He had always delegated. He assumed his name still carried enough weight to keep things moving. But something had shifted. His assistant began rescheduling meetings without explanation. His CFO grew evasive. One morning, a key investor pulled out of a major deal without warning. Adrian walked into his office, slammed the door, and demanded answers. "We're tightening things," his CFO said vaguely. Some of the numbers weren't adding up. "It's just internal housekeeping." But Adrian wasn't a fool. He'd built empires from the ground up. He knew when something wasn't right. That evening, he brought it up to Sienna. "Have you heard anything strange about my business lately?" he asked as they sat in their private lounge. She didn't look up from her phone. "I don't know. You're the one running the empire, not me." He studied her face. There was a new detachment in her tone, a cool indifference that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, and he just hadn't noticed. "Something's off," he muttered. Sienna finally looked at him. "Maybe you should pay closer attention then." The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. Emails went unanswered. Deadlines passed without explanation. A trusted consultant abruptly quit, citing personal reasons. Adrian began staying late at the office, digging into financial reports himself. He hadn't done that in years. What he found disturbed him. Money moved to accounts he didn't recognize. Large transactions marked as consulting fees with unfamiliar names. He flagged them, sent questions, requested documentation. No one responded. He fired 2 department heads. Still, nothing changed. The rot was deeper than he thought. Sienna, meanwhile, seemed unfazed. She continued expanding her brand, hiring PR teams, posing for cover shoots, partnering with high-end designers. Adrian watched her from across their penthouse, often wondering how 2 people could share so much space and be so entirely alone. She stopped asking about his day. She stopped touching him. Even their arguments became rehearsed, a script they both followed out of habit. "You're distracted," she snapped one evening. "You're paranoid. It's affecting us." Adrian stared at her. "There is no us," he said quietly. "There's just a photograph we keep printing." One night, Adrian received a call from his lawyer, the one who usually only contacted him about high-level matters. "We need to talk," the man said gravely. "There's a situation. A legal notice was filed today." Adrian sat up in bed, heart racing. "What kind of notice?" "It's a petition. Custody-related. There's a child involved." Silence. Adrian's mind went blank. "That's impossible," he said. "I have no children." Apparently, that's not what the petition claims. He hung up the call in disbelief, staring at the wall as the weight of those words sank in. A child? How could that be? He hadn't spoken to Emma in over a year. Could she be behind this? Why now? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone was trying to get money. But deep inside, something told him this wasn't just a baseless claim. Something was unraveling, and he didn't know how to stop it. The next day, he confronted Sienna. "Did you know about this?" he asked, holding the letter in his hand. She shrugged. "What am I supposed to know? I'm not your secretary." "You're not anything," he snapped. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "You heard me," he said, throwing the paper on the counter. "This whole thing, this life we've built, it's paper thin." "Then leave," she said coldly. "If you're so miserable, walk out that door." Adrian didn't answer. He turned away and poured himself a drink instead. By the end of the week, his attorney confirmed what he feared. The child in question was his. DNA tests had been conducted discreetly, and there was no doubt. Emma hadn't filed for child support. She hadn't contacted him at all. But now, she had allowed the legal system to do what she never did herself, force him to face the consequences. Adrian stared at the report in disbelief. He remembered the day he left her, how her hand rested on her belly, how she said he would regret it. And he had laughed inside, certain that she'd fade from his life like a forgotten chapter. But she hadn't. She'd raised their child alone, without him, without his name, his money, or his presence. And now, he was being pulled back into a life he'd tried to erase. The media found out within days. Headlines exploded. Millionaire father of secret child. Lawsuit rocks Blake empire. Hidden heir discovered. Adrian's image crumbled in front of the public eye. Investors panicked. His stock plummeted. Sienna vanished from their apartment without warning, taking her designer wardrobe and a carefully crafted press statement about needing time to reflect. She sold an exclusive interview the next week, positioning herself as the unsuspecting woman caught in a scandal. Adrian watched her speak on television, smiling gracefully as she told the world she'd had no idea he was hiding such a secret. He turned off the screen in silence. Alone in the penthouse, he walked through rooms that now felt like empty monuments to a life he no longer understood. Every surface gleamed, every painting was in place, but it all felt meaningless. He sat in the center of the vast living room, staring at the letter from the court, the DNA test, and a family photo Emma had enclosed. A simple picture of a child he had never met. For the first time in his life, Adrian Blake didn't know what to do next. And the worst was yet to come. The boardroom was colder than usual, both in temperature and mood. Adrian sat at the head of the table, staring blankly at the presentation projected on the wall. Financial charts, projections, risk analyses, it all looked like white noise. Around him, his executives discussed damage control, media spin, and restructuring plans, but he barely heard a word. His eyes were fixed on a photo clipped to the corner of a manila folder, his son's photo. A child he had never held, never spoken to, never seen except through a single image. A boy with eyes far too familiar, with a face that bore the undeniable echo of his own. The more he stared at it, the more the noise around him faded. None of the numbers in that room could compete with the weight of that face. The moment the meeting ended, Adrian stood up without a word and walked out. His assistant tried to follow, papers in hand, but he waved her off. He needed air. Not the recirculated corporate air that filled every inch of his empire, but real air, wind, noise, something unpredictable. He walked through the streets without direction, suit jacket in hand, tie loosened. People passed him without recognition. For once, he wasn't being followed by cameras or praised for his influence. He was just another man in a crowd, consumed by thoughts of everything he had left behind. He didn't go home. He went to a quiet bar on the west side of the city, the kind of place where no one cared who you were as long as you tipped well and didn't start trouble. He sat in a booth and ordered a drink. Then another. He wasn't a heavy drinker, but that night, he needed to silence the storm inside him. The bartender turned on a small TV behind the counter, and the evening news played. Adrian looked up just in time to see his own face flash across the screen. Headlines about his hidden child, the court petition, the financial investigation. His scandal had become a national obsession. Anchors debated his character, experts speculated on the legal implications, and former associates gave thinly veiled interviews about his ruthless ambition. He watched in silence, numb. This was his legacy now. Not the towers he built, not the deals he brokered, but a child he abandoned and a scandal he could no longer outrun. Meanwhile, Emma's life remained steady. She didn't want to bask in revenge. She didn't celebrate his downfall. She simply continued caring for her son, guiding him through everyday routines. She hadn't spoken to Adrian, not once since the court process began. But her lawyer had advised that a DNA test was inevitable, and she agreed. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. If her son was to grow up with any sense of legal protection, the truth had to be official. Still, she struggled with the idea of Adrian suddenly appearing in their lives. She knew him. She knew the way he could charm, manipulate, present himself as reformed. And she feared what that could do to a child who didn't yet understand the weight of disappointment. Adrian, for his part, wasn't interested in charm anymore. He was unraveling. The people around him began to shift. Friends stopped calling. Business partners distanced themselves. Even his own family, whom he rarely saw, issued statements about respecting privacy during this difficult time, which was code for "we want nothing to do with this mess." He was no longer a respected figure. He was a liability. And the more he tried to patch the holes in his image, the more the fabric tore. Sienna, meanwhile, continued her media tour, positioning herself as the misunderstood woman who had been betrayed by a man with secrets. Adrian couldn't stomach watching her anymore. He turned off every screen, avoided social media, isolated himself from the world he once dominated. Then came the subpoena, a second legal notice, this time not about the child, but about his finances. Adrian sat at his desk, reading the thick stack of documents delivered by courier. He flipped through them slowly, each page more damning than the last. Years of questionable transactions, questionable partnerships, shell accounts, all now under legal scrutiny. A formal audit was underway, and it wasn't just civil. The letter bore the seal of the federal government. This wasn't a corporate slap on the wrist. This was criminal investigation, financial fraud, tax evasion, potential prison time. He called his lawyer in a panic, demanding answers, explanations, escape routes. But there were none. His empire had been built too recklessly, with too many shortcuts. And now every corner of it was being dissected under a microscope. His lawyer's voice on the phone was calm, almost surgical. "We need to prepare for the worst," he said. "This is not just a PR nightmare anymore. It's legal, it's real, and it's coming fast." Adrian hung up and sat alone in the dim office. His thoughts drifted, strangely, not to the empire collapsing around him, but to his son, the child he had ignored, forgotten, dismissed. What kind of man had he been? What kind of father would he have been? Could he even claim to want redemption now? Or was it already too late? He drove that night, without thinking, and ended up outside Emma's building. He sat in his car for nearly an hour, watching the lights from her apartment window. He didn't go up. He didn't call. He just sat there, consumed by something he hadn't felt in years, shame. He imagined his son sleeping peacefully inside, unaware of the man sitting outside with a heart full of regret and a past full of sins. Eventually, he drove away, more lost than when he arrived. The next morning, he was served again, this time by federal agents. Not arrested, not yet, but formally notified. His accounts were being frozen, his properties flagged for seizure, his travel rights suspended. His world, once limitless, was shrinking by the hour. The glamorous life he had once chased now lay in ruins, and he was beginning to see it for what it had always been, a distraction from the emptiness within. At his next meeting with his legal team, they reviewed options: plea deals, asset liquidation, damage control. You need character witnesses, one of the attorneys said. People who can speak to your integrity, your role as a father. Adrian laughed bitterly. Integrity? I don't think anyone even remembers what that word means when they look at me. What about the child's mother? The attorney asked. Would she speak on your behalf? Adrian looked down. I don't think she'd even take my call. Later that week, Emma received a letter. It wasn't from the court. It wasn't a demand. It was handwritten. From Adrian. He didn't beg. He didn't apologize with grandeur. He simply wrote, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to meet my son. To know the life I gave up. Not for me. For him. If you decide I don't deserve it, I'll understand. But I had to try. Emma read it twice. Then a third time. She didn't respond. Not yet. But she held the letter a little longer before placing it in a drawer beside the others. Letters she had once written to him, but never sent. Maybe, just maybe, some ghosts from the past were meant to resurface. Not to destroy, but to remind them both of the life they could still salvage. And far from the glow of paparazzi cameras and courtroom drama, a small boy played on the floor with building blocks, unaware of the war unfolding in the adult world. He built towers, knocked them down, and built them again. It was a simple rhythm. Destruction, reconstruction, a cycle his father was only beginning to understand. And soon, that understanding would be put to the ultimate test. The courtroom was quiet in a way that made every shuffle, every whisper, and every ticking second feel deafening. Adrian stood near his attorney, dressed in a somber gray suit, far less tailored and flamboyant than his usual wardrobe. He hadn't shaved that morning. He hadn't slept either. The weight under his eyes revealed more than exhaustion. It revealed a man who had lost control of the narrative, the wealth, the power, and, for the first time in his life, the confidence that once seemed embedded in his DNA. Around him, journalists whispered, clicking their pens and refreshing their phones, waiting to pounce on every word, every gesture. He could feel their eyes crawling over his skin like static, and yet, none of it compared to the fear rising in his chest at the thought of what was about to happen. Emma walked into the courtroom with quiet grace, her expression unreadable. She wore no makeup, no designer clothes, just a simple dress and a cardigan. But she carried herself with a dignity that made Adrian's presence feel loud and misplaced. In her arms, she held their son. The child, barely 3, looked around curiously, unaware of the tension saturating the room. Adrian couldn't breathe. For a moment, it was like a mirror had been placed before him, reflecting everything he'd chosen to ignore. The boy had his hair, his eyes, even the same curious tilt of the head when observing new spaces. Adrian's fingers twitched at his side. He wanted to move, to say something, to bridge the chasm between them, but his legs wouldn't respond, as if the guilt had turned to concrete inside him. The judge arrived, and proceedings began. It was clinical at first, names, documentation, legal context. But then Emma was called to the stand. Adrian watched her walk across the room, each step measured, calm, certain. Her voice was steady as she answered questions from the attorneys, describing her experience raising the child alone. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She spoke facts. But the weight of those facts fell heavy on Adrian's chest. She spoke of late nights, unpaid bills, medical visits alone, Birthdays spent with just 2 chairs at the table, decisions made without guidance, moments of doubt and fear. But she also spoke of joy, of quiet triumphs, of how fiercely she loved the child they had created, how she never regretted him, even if she regretted the man who gave him life. Adrian's attorney asked if she intended to keep the child from him. She paused, then looked at Adrian directly. "I never wanted revenge," she said. "I didn't file this out of spite. I just wanted protection, legal clarity, for my son. Because if anything happened to me, I needed to know he'd be safe. Not in the hands of someone who sees people as assets or liabilities, but someone capable of growth. I wanted to see who Adrian truly was when responsibility wasn't convenient." The judge asked Adrian if he wanted to say anything. He hadn't prepared a statement, but he stood. His voice was hoarse when he began. "I don't have an excuse," he said plainly. "I don't have a speech. I left. I abandoned them. Not because I hated them, but because I was selfish. I thought I was chasing something better. I thought glamour meant success. But I see now that I left behind the only thing that ever mattered. I can't erase the choices I made. But I want to try to be present, try to support, try to learn. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to be part of his life, even if only from a distance, even if just to prove that I can be better than the man I used to be." There was silence afterward. Even the reporters held their breath. The judge recessed, needing time to deliberate, but the emotional impact had already hit everyone in that room like a storm. Emma walked out of the courtroom with her son, but her steps were slower this time. She didn't glance back, but Adrian noticed how her shoulders weren't as rigid as before. Something had shifted, even if only slightly. Outside the courthouse, Adrian was swarmed by press, but he ignored them, walking straight to his car, the photograph of his son still clenched tightly in his jacket pocket. That night, he sat on his apartment balcony for hours, staring into the city that once bowed before him. Now it moved on without him. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, and let the silence carry his thoughts. Every moment since the custody case had begun had felt like unraveling stitches. One by one, the facade came apart. His career, his public image, his wealth. And now, standing in the rubble of his empire, he found himself wondering not how to reclaim it, but whether he should even try. The following week, Emma's lawyer contacted him. The court had approved shared legal guardianship, but limited visitation. The judge had been cautious, citing concerns about Adrian's public image and legal standing. But it was a beginning. Adrian would be allowed supervised visits for now, brief, structured, carefully monitored meetings. It wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't closeness, but it was a chance. The first visit was scheduled at a family counseling center, a neutral space designed to ease the transition for children unfamiliar with absent parents. Adrian arrived early, sitting awkwardly in a room decorated with posters of rainbows and stuffed animals. His heart pounded like a drum. Then the door opened, and Emma walked in holding their son's hand. The child looked around curiously, then looked at Adrian. No recognition, no warmth, just innocent eyes taking in a stranger. "Hi," Adrian said softly, kneeling down. I'm Adrian." The boy looked at Emma. She gave a gentle nod. "This is your father," she said simply. Adrian's throat tightened. The word hit him harder than he anticipated. Father. He extended a small toy car, one he had bought after obsessively researching what 3-year-olds liked. The boy hesitated, then took it, curiosity overtaking caution. They sat on the floor together, playing quietly, building little towers with colored blocks, exchanging few words but many glances. Every time the boy laughed, Adrian felt a pang in his chest. Every moment was a reminder of what he'd missed, of what he had traded for status and applause. And yet, for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. The visits continued weekly. The boy remained quiet at first, but slowly, patterns emerged. A shared smile, a request for another story, a moment of trust when he climbed onto Adrian's lap during playtime. Each visit ended too soon, each goodbye a twist of regret. But Adrian didn't push. He followed the rules. He let the boy set the pace. And Emma, though still guarded, began to see something different in him. Something real, something changed. One day, after a visit, Emma lingered in the doorway as Adrian prepared to leave. "He's warming up to you," she said. Adrian nodded. "I don't deserve it," he replied. "But I'm grateful." Emma didn't smile, but her expression softened. People can change, she said. But change is a choice, not a performance. Adrian took those words to heart. And as he walked into the night, his mind no longer focused on court dates or financial reports. All he thought about was that small boy who had smiled at him without knowing the pain he had once caused. All he hoped was that one day, that smile would become trust. And perhaps, one day, love. But the journey had just begun, and shadows from another part of his past were still waiting to rise. The silence in Adrian's office was not the usual kind. This one had teeth. It bit into the air, into his skin, into the fabric of his once polished world. He sat alone behind his massive desk, staring at a financial audit report that might as well have been a death sentence. Pages of figures, transactions, and flagged inconsistencies stared back at him, each one a dagger pointing toward a future he never anticipated. The numbers, once his allies, now betrayed him with surgical precision. Every page carried the weight of choices made in greed, shortcuts taken without pause, and the arrogance of believing he was untouchable. His fingers trembled as he flipped another page, revealing more irregularities, more phantom companies, more routing of funds to accounts that should have never existed. He wasn't just facing legal complications anymore. He was facing the unraveling of everything he had ever built. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A compliance officer had raised a concern during a routine internal review, just a few line items that didn't add up. Adrian dismissed it at first, assuming it was a clerical error. But then a second review confirmed the discrepancies. An internal investigator was brought in, and within days, the entire financial infrastructure of his corporation began to cave under scrutiny. The shell companies, once created to discreetly handle foreign investments and minimize taxation, now looked like classic laundering mechanisms. The consultant invoices he had signed off without a second glance now appeared tied to non-existent services. Payments had been routed through multiple international accounts, all pointing to deliberate financial manipulation. And the worst part, some of those signatures weren't even his. Someone within his own organization had been operating behind his back. But it didn't matter. His name was on the documents. His empire. His responsibility. As federal agents expanded their investigation, subpoenas rained down like hail. Partners were called to testify. Emails were pulled, phone records combed, contracts scrutinized. Adrian's legal team scrambled to form a defense, but even the best attorneys couldn't defend what was becoming clearer by the hour. What had once been lauded as business genius was now being rebranded as corporate fraud. He had crossed lines without realizing how deeply, and now he was trapped in a maze of his own making. The media feasted on it. Headlines shifted from scandal to indictment speculation. He couldn't leave his apartment without cameras ambushing him. Former allies appeared on talk shows, distancing themselves, calling him reckless, disconnected, a cautionary tale. The word fraud began to cling to his name like a stain no amount of spin could wash away. Even Sienna, who had temporarily vanished during the early fallout, reappeared, not to offer support, but to finalize her exit strategy. She filed for separation, citing irreconcilable differences, and released a carefully curated public statement claiming she had been kept in the dark about all financial dealings. Adrian watched her face on television, her tearful interview, her performative sighs, her calculated pauses. He knew she was lying, but he also knew that her lies were more believable than his truths. She had always been good at playing the victim when it suited her. And now, she was winning sympathy points while he sank deeper into public disgrace. In private, Adrian began losing access to everything he once took for granted. His accounts were frozen. Credit cards declined. Personal staff quit. His penthouse was now subject to asset seizure. He sat alone in rooms that once symbolized power and success, now echoing with absence. The silence of empty hallways, the dust gathering on unused furniture, the unopened bottles of vintage wine. Everything whispered the same thing. This was never real. Not truly. Just a facade, a mask too tight to wear forever. His legal counsel presented options. Fight the charges in court and risk decades in prison, or negotiate a plea deal, cooperate, give names, surrender assets, accept a reduced sentence. The idea of imprisonment made his stomach churn, but the idea of living in hiding, branded as a criminal, wasn't any better. He paced the floor for hours, trying to think, to plan, to salvage something from the wreckage. But there was nothing left to salvage. The walls were closing in. Even his own body felt heavy, like guilt had become part of his skin. One evening, he received a call from Daniel Morgan, the young lawyer who had first uncovered the financial irregularities. It wasn't a legal call. It was personal. "I'm not calling as part of the investigation," Daniel said calmly. "I just wanted to tell you something. Off the record. You may have built something great once, but you let it rot. You didn't just cut corners, you erased the blueprint of decency. And people like me, young attorneys trying to make it in a system built for men like you, we see what you left behind, and we know we don't want to become it." Then the line went dead. Adrian stared at the phone long after the call ended. That voice, the calm, resolute condemnation, was more painful than 1,000 headlines. It wasn't just about fraud. It was about who he had become. He had believed in the illusion that power was an end in itself, that success justified anything, that loyalty was optional. But now, as his world collapsed piece by piece, he realized that the only thing truly criminal wasn't the paperwork or the money. It was how easily he had traded his soul for a spotlight. 1 week later, the official indictment arrived. Federal charges of financial fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Bail was denied. His lawyer had tried to argue that Adrian wasn't a flight risk, that he was cooperating, but the judge wasn't convinced. The courtroom echoed with the sound of the gavel, and Adrian felt the surreal moment hit him like ice. He was handcuffed in front of reporters, escorted out of the building like a thief. Flashbulbs blinded him, reporters shouted questions, and the sound of camera shutters chased him into the van that would take him to holding. From a distance, Emma watched it unfold on television, not with vengeance in her heart, but with a quiet understanding. She knew this wasn't the end, it was just another chapter. She didn't celebrate his fall, but she did feel a sense of closure. For years, she had carried the weight of abandonment, the silence of unanswered questions, the burden of being left behind. Now, the world finally saw the man behind the mask. Her son sat beside her, playing with a toy, unaware of the images on the screen. She turned it off gently, choosing not to let those images define the future he would grow into. But deep down, a question lingered. What would she say when her son asked who his father was? What story would she tell? And more importantly, what story would he write himself when he was old enough to choose? As Adrian sat alone in his holding cell that night, staring at the concrete walls and flickering lights, he realized he wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of being forgotten, of becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale, of being a man whose name once stood for success, now synonymous with betrayal and greed. And the most painful part of it all, he had no one left to blame but himself. And beyond the cold steel bars and legal transcripts, something deeper was breaking inside him. A realization that freedom wasn't just physical. Freedom was loyalty. Freedom was love. Freedom was something he had thrown away chasing glamour. And now, it might be gone forever. The prison walls were not what Adrian Blake had expected. He had always imagined confinement as crude and filthy, the kind of chaos reserved for men whose lives had long been steeped in crime. But the reality was quieter, more sterile, far colder in its indifference. The cell was clean but suffocating, a small concrete box with a steel-framed bed, a rusted sink, and a narrow slit for a window that offered only a sliver of sky. There were no shouting guards, no echoes of violence down the halls, just the persistent hum of fluorescent lights and the haunting stillness of routine. That stillness, however, was what unraveled Adrian faster than any rough condition ever could. There was no distraction here. No meetings, no interviews, no galas, no champagne toasts. Only his thoughts. And those thoughts, now louder than ever, tore through him with relentless precision. He spent the first few days in silence, trying to adapt to the rhythms of the place. Lights on at dawn, head counts, bland meals, endless hours of nothingness. He spoke little to anyone. Most inmates didn't know who he was. Some had seen his face on television, but none cared. Here, there were no millionaires, no glamour, no influence, just names turned into numbers and pride turned into memory. He was just another body in a system that didn't care who he had once been. And slowly, the detachment from his previous life began to burn a hole in his sense of identity. He was no longer Adrian Blake, the mogul, the visionary, the man who wore power like a second skin. He was inmate number 62493, and the weight of that new title pressed on him like iron chains. Letters began to arrive. Not from friends. Those had vanished the moment the headlines broke. Not from business partners. They had either distanced themselves or joined the pack of wolves looking to tear apart the remains of his empire. The letters were from lawyers, court officials, government agencies. Cold, clinical papers detailing asset seizures, fines, new hearings, and lawsuits filed by former employees who had lost everything when his companies collapsed. He read each letter in silence, then folded them neatly and stacked them in a corner of his cell. By the end of the second week, the stack had grown into a tower of shame, a testament to the empire he had once built and destroyed with his own hands. But not every letter came from the legal world. One morning, a guard approached his cell holding a plain envelope. No return address, just his name on the front, written in a delicate, unfamiliar script. He opened it slowly, hands trembling slightly, heart pounding. Inside was a drawing, a child's drawing. Crayon scribbles of a man, a woman, and a small boy standing between them. Above it, written in large, uneven letters, "My family." Adrian stared at it for a long time, the corners of his eyes burning. It wasn't signed, but he didn't need a signature. He knew exactly who had drawn it. And something in him cracked open. A soft ache surged through his chest, one he hadn't felt in years. Not guilt, not shame, something deeper. A longing, a loss, a tiny fragment of hope flickering in the ruins of his life. He folded the drawing gently, placing it beside his bed, the only personal item in the cell. Each time he looked at it, 1,000 memories surfaced, some real, some imagined. The way Emma used to smile when she read a book beside him. The sound of laughter echoing through a home he never made time to build. The scent of newborn skin he had never held. 1,000 what-ifs began to haunt his nights. What if he hadn't left? What if he had stayed? What if he had chosen loyalty instead of glamour? Those questions spun around his mind like a cruel carousel, offering no exit. His lawyer visited once a week, always trying to keep things practical, strategy, appeals, future options. But Adrian no longer cared about any of it. He listened out of courtesy, nodded when expected, but said little. He knew what was coming. The trial had already begun without him. His name was synonymous with corruption now, a permanent fixture in news cycles, in textbooks, in lectures about greed and downfall. He was no longer a businessman. He was a case study. And the irony of it all, the man who once orchestrated empires with spreadsheets and charm, was now at the mercy of the same system he once manipulated so easily. Inside the prison, whispers began to spread. Other inmates started to recognize him, some with curiosity, others with resentment. One day, a man in the yard walked up to him, smirking. "So you're the guy who thought money could buy the world," he said. Adrian didn't respond. He just looked at him, eyes hollow. The man chuckled. "Doesn't work so well in here, does it?" Then he walked away, leaving Adrian standing alone under the gray sky. The words echoed, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He spent more time in the prison library, not to escape, but to try to remember who he had once been. He read books he hadn't touched since college, philosophy, ethics, human behavior. He took notes, not because he needed them, but because the act of writing gave his day some purpose. He began volunteering in the prison education program, helping other inmates prepare for GED exams. At first, they were skeptical. What did a fraudster have to teach them? But slowly, his presence became routine. He didn't talk about his past. He didn't pretend to be noble. He just showed up every day, helping with math problems and reading comprehension exercises. And in that simple act, he began to reclaim a fragment of the humanity he had lost. Meanwhile, Emma continued raising their son with quiet strength. She had seen the news, the coverage of the collapse, the sentencing updates. She had read about the fraud, the lawsuits, the interviews with former colleagues who claimed they had always suspected something. But she didn't allow any of it to affect her home. She kept the television off when her son was around. She answered his questions gently, age-appropriately, never speaking ill of Adrian, but never hiding the truth either. She told him his father had made mistakes, big ones, but that people could change if they chose to. And though she still carried pain, she had let go of hatred. It wasn't useful. It wouldn't protect her child. Only love could do that. Real, grounded love, the kind Adrian had never understood until it was too late. And somewhere deep within those prison walls, Adrian began to feel that love in the smallest of ways. In the memory of a child's smile, in the drawing taped beside his bed, in the whispered words of a bedtime story he never got to read, in the hope that maybe, just maybe, if he kept showing up, if he kept trying, he could build something again, not an empire, but a bridge. A bridge back to the son he had lost. A bridge toward the kind of man he wished he had been all along. The collapse was complete. The empire was gone. The glamour was dust. But beneath the rubble, something unexpected had survived, the fragile seed of redemption. And Adrian, once the man who believed he could control the world, now held that seed with trembling hands, unsure if it would ever grow, but determined, for the first time in his life, to try nurturing it anyway. The courtroom felt colder this time, not because of the air, but because of what was at stake. Adrian sat stiffly at the defendant's table, flanked by attorneys dressed in perfectly pressed suits, their briefcases overflowing with documents, arguments, and strategies. But no amount of legal preparation could mask what was written across Adrian's face. A quiet, worn resignation that no longer belonged to a man trying to win, but to someone trying not to break apart completely. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but he could feel the attention, the invisible weight of every eye outside those walls watching, judging, dissecting his downfall in real time. This wasn't just a trial, it was a public dissection. The millionaire turned fraud, the glamorous figure who now wore shame like a second skin. The prosecution didn't hold back. They painted him as a manipulative architect of deceit, a man who had leveraged influence and wealth to build an empire of lies. They cited falsified financial statements, offshore shell corporations, forged contracts, illegal tax shelters, and systematic exploitation of regulatory loopholes. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail hammered into his already collapsing identity. Witnesses took the stand, former employees, financial experts, auditors, all presenting a consistent story. Adrian Blake had knowingly orchestrated a network of deception for personal gain. One of his former senior advisors, a man Adrian once considered loyal, testified in chilling detail about how he was instructed to find ways around compliance, how Adrian had prioritized appearances over integrity at every turn. Adrian didn't flinch. He had expected this. He even agreed, silently, with some of the things they said. He had created a monster and pretended not to see it grow. The defense tried to humanize him. They spoke of pressure, misjudgments, overdelegation. They argued that the empire had grown too fast, that others had exploited loopholes without his knowledge. But the damage had already been done. The courtroom wasn't interested in nuance. It wanted a villain, and Adrian fit the part. Every time his name was mentioned, it felt like a slap echoing in the chamber. He sat still, breathing slow, watching his life being dismantled in legal terms he once used to wield like weapons. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Emma was called to the stand, not as a hostile witness, not as a character assassin, but as a person requested by the prosecution to provide context on Adrian's personal history and ethics. She hesitated as she approached the seat, not because she was nervous, but because she understood the gravity of being there. Adrian looked at her, not with defiance, not with pride, but with a quiet kind of remorse that words couldn't express. Emma sat tall, composed, dignified. The same grace that had once gone unnoticed in a room full of sequins and spotlights now commanded the entire courtroom's attention. The prosecutor asked her questions about their past, about who Adrian was before the wealth, before the scandal. Emma answered with care. She didn't vilify him. She spoke honestly, recalling the ambitious young man she met years ago, the one who was driven, confident, even charming. But she also spoke of the shift, the gradual erosion of values, the prioritization of image over substance. I watched him change, she said softly. I watched him chase a version of success that wasn't real. And when that version demanded loyalty, he abandoned everything else, his marriage, his child, his own peace of mind. When asked why she hadn't come forward earlier, why she had remained silent for so long, her answer was simple. Because I wasn't trying to destroy him, she said. I was trying to protect myself and my son. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted safety. And sometimes, silence is the only shield a person has when they've been discarded. Then, in an unexpected turn, Adrian's own attorney requested that Emma stay on the stand for a few follow-up questions. Everyone in the room tensed slightly. Emma looked to the judge, who allowed it. The defense lawyer approached, calm and deliberate. "You mentioned that Mr. Blake changed over time," he began. "Do you believe he's capable of change again?" Now, there was a long pause, the kind that held weight. Emma looked directly at Adrian, her eyes unreadable. Then, she turned back to the lawyer. "I believe anyone can change," she said, "but only if they stop performing and start facing who they really are. I don't know if Adrian's reached that place yet, but I hope, for his sake and our sons, that he does." That final line hung in the air like smoke. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed to take a moment before moving forward. And as Emma stepped down from the witness stand, she didn't look back. Adrian watched her walk away, a slow ache forming in his chest that no sentence could match. The trial continued for days. More evidence, more testimonies, more damage. Adrian sat through it all without protest. He didn't deny. He didn't deflect. He accepted. And when the final arguments were made, when the jury retired to deliberate, there was a strange stillness in him. Not peace, exactly, but clarity. He had lost, not just in court, but in life. The trial was just the formal acknowledgement of a collapse that had begun long before the first charge was filed. The jury returned swiftly. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on multiple counts. The judge's sentence came days later, 15 years, with the possibility of parole in 10, pending good behavior and cooperation with ongoing investigations. The courtroom buzzed. Reporters ran to their stations. The headlines exploded again, but Adrian didn't react. He simply stood, nodded, and allowed the officers to escort him out. No tears, no outrage, just acceptance. The clinking of handcuffs echoed down the corridor as he left, not as a millionaire, but as a man stripped of everything but memory. In the weeks that followed, the world moved on. Another scandal replaced his. Another billionaire's face took his place in headlines. But in a small apartment across town, Emma folded laundry while her son built towers out of wooden blocks. Life moved gently there, slowly, and one evening, as she tucked him into bed, he asked, "Is my daddy in trouble?" Emma paused, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Yes," she said softly, "but sometimes people have to go through hard things so they can learn to be better." The boy nodded, not fully understanding but trusting her words. And in a prison cell across the city, Adrian lay on his bunk, staring at the drawing beside him. The one with the 3 stick figures and the word family scribbled in bright colors. He read it like scripture, held it like it was fragile. Because it was. Because that hope, however distant, however fragile, was now the only thing keeping him from disappearing completely. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the guilt, the grief, and the shame, a quiet question still lived. Could redemption still be possible? And if so, would anyone believe it if it came from a man who once lost everything to chase glamour over loyalty? Time moved differently behind bars. It wasn't marked by meetings or deadlines anymore, not by flights or dinners or magazine covers. It moved in slower increments now, in the echo of footsteps during head counts, in the monotony of meal trays, in the way daylight slithered through the narrow window above Adrian's bed and vanished again without warning. In prison, there were no calendars pinned to the wall with events circled in red. There were only weeks that blurred into months, moments that repeated themselves like echoes in a hollow chamber. For Adrian, this wasn't merely a sentence. It was a slow confrontation with everything he had ignored for years. And though the walls were concrete, it was the silence that confined him most. He had spent so much of his life chasing noise, applause, attention, deals, headlines. But here, in the stark quiet of a place that didn't care who he had once been, he was left only with his thoughts. At first, he tried to drown them out by staying busy. He volunteered for tasks in the library, helped tutor other inmates, kept journals where he scribbled nonsense just to fill the page. But eventually, the silence crept in again, forcing him to sit with himself, truly sit with himself, for the first time in years. And it was in that silence that the real punishment began. Every mistake played back like a film reel, leaving Emma without a word, dismissing her love as weakness, ignoring her strength, choosing glamour over loyalty, over life, over the only real thing he'd ever had. He remembered the moment he left their home, suitcase in hand, ego inflated, eyes on the future he thought he deserved. He remembered her face at the doorway, heartbroken but composed, pleading without words. He remembered the way her hands instinctively cradled her pregnant belly as he turned his back. That image haunted him. It followed him through every corridor, every sleepless night, every courtroom appearance. And now, years later, it was clearer than ever. He hadn't just walked away from a woman. He'd walked away from himself. The drawing still hung beside his bed. Crayon lines, faded from time, edges curled slightly, but still intact. His son's drawing. The only proof that, somewhere beyond these walls, he had once mattered to someone. He read it daily, whispered words to it sometimes as if it were a sacred ritual. He imagined what his son's voice might sound like now, what stories he liked, what questions he asked. He imagined sitting beside him, reading, laughing, teaching him how to ride a bike. But those moments remained locked in the realm of imagination. He knew he didn't deserve to insert himself into the child's life again, not unless Emma allowed it. And so he didn't ask. He waited. Letters were all he had. He wrote them every week, some for his son, others for Emma. He never sent them. They filled a stack beneath his mattress, pages of raw honesty, of memories, apologies, stories, hopes, lessons. Sometimes, he wrote about what he was learning in prison. Sometimes, he wrote about the small things, how the sunrise looked different through bars, how kindness appeared in unexpected places, how guilt wasn't a punishment but a mirror. He didn't write to win favor. He didn't write hoping for redemption. He wrote because it was the only way he knew to keep part of himself alive. And every time he folded a letter, he felt a little lighter, a little less like the man he had once been. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted again. It came quietly, without fanfare. A letter slipped beneath his door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, smaller, uneven. Inside, a single page and a photo. The photo showed his son standing beside a school project, construction paper cutouts of a family tree. On it, 3 names. Emma, his son, and, written in a careful, hesitant scrawl, Adrian Blake. Underneath, a simple message. He asked about you today. I thought you should know. Adrian held the paper with trembling hands. He stared at the photo until his eyes blurred. His son had remembered him, had included him, not out of obligation, not because of a court order, but out of something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps, or hope. Adrian didn't know what this meant. He didn't dare interpret it as an invitation. But to him, it was more than he ever expected. And it changed everything. That night, he pulled out one of his unsent letters and began a new one. This time, he didn't write as a man seeking forgiveness. He wrote as a father. He told stories. Funny, simple stories from his own childhood. Stories of mistakes, of dreams, of lessons learned. He didn't try to impress. He tried to be honest. Raw. Real. He enclosed a drawing of his own, a clumsy sketch of a rocket ship, a memory from his childhood when he dreamed of being an astronaut. He wrote beneath it, "This is the first thing I ever wanted to be. Before everything else. Before money. Before success. I wanted to explore the stars. I don't know where your dreams will take you, but I hope you never forget how far you can go." Weeks passed. Then, another letter arrived. This time, from Emma. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. He liked the rocket ship. He asked if you'll send more stories. Adrian cried that night. Not from sadness, not from regret, but from something purer. Connection. A thread, however fragile, had been formed. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something again. Not a company, not a brand. A life. A story. The correspondence continued, slow and steady. Emma remained cautious, but open. The letters grew deeper, warmer. Sometimes Adrian wrote bedtime stories. Sometimes he sent silly jokes. Sometimes he shared lessons from his cell, how he learned patience, humility, grace. He never asked to be visited. He never pushed for forgiveness. He let the relationship unfold naturally, like a flower blooming in late spring. Unexpected, delicate, but breathtaking in its quiet resilience. He had nothing else. No empire, no fortune, no accolades. But he had a thread of redemption. And that thread, however thin, gave him purpose. It gave him something to wake up for, to write for, to live for. Years later, long after the media had moved on, long after his name had faded from the headlines, Adrian Blake remained in prison, serving his time. But something had shifted within him. He wasn't just a man marked by mistakes. He was a man rebuilding something unseen, something far more powerful than wealth. And though he still wore a uniform, still walked confined halls, still slept behind bars, his spirit began to feel something unfamiliar. Freedom. Not the kind you walk into, but the kind you earn, one honest word at a time. Emma stood at the window of her modest home, the soft morning light spilling across the living room floor. The walls were adorned with crayon drawings, photographs of school milestones, and homemade crafts that marked birthdays and holidays. It was a far cry from the marble and grandeur she had once shared with Adrian, but it carried a warmth those cold, opulent walls never could. There was life here, real life, the kind that bloomed from chaos and sacrifice, from sleepless nights and whispered bedtime stories. Her son, now a bright and curious 6-year-old, ran through the hallway clutching a plastic spaceship, his laughter filling the air like music. Emma smiled faintly, a gentle ache blooming in her chest as she watched him turn the couch into a rocket control station. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee, her thoughts already drifting toward the letter she had received the night before. It had come from Adrian again, not through the legal system or formal channels, but a personal letter, carefully handwritten, addressed only to her. Inside, he had enclosed another drawing for their son, this one of a makeshift space station with notes scribbled along the edges. Explanations of how astronauts lived in zero gravity, how planets moved in orbit, how dreams could be both imaginary and tangible. Adrian's letters had grown softer, more thoughtful, less like a man trying to earn forgiveness, and more like a father simply trying to connect. Emma no longer dreaded them. She read each one carefully, sometimes twice, before deciding whether to share them with their son. Not all of them made it to the boy's hands. Some she kept, unsure of how to explain certain emotions. Others she read aloud, letting her son giggle at the silly stories, ask questions about space and stars, about what kind of food astronauts ate, and whether his father ever saw a comet. She still remembered the day she finally told her son the truth. Not everything. He was too young for all the complexities, but enough. She had waited until the right moment, when his questions had become more direct and his eyes more searching. Your father made mistakes, she had said gently, big ones. But he's learning from them. He's trying to be better now. The boy had nodded solemnly, too young to grasp the depth of it all, but old enough to understand the gravity of that word, mistakes. Then he had asked, is he a bad person? Emma had paused, choosing her words with care. No, he did bad things, but people can change. And sometimes, trying to do better is the bravest thing a person can do. That night, her son had drawn a picture of a man in a rocket ship waving toward Earth, with the words, "Keep learning, Dad," written underneath. Emma had mailed it without telling Adrian. Some things didn't need permission. Adrian's letters became the rhythm of weeks, a quiet thread woven into their new life. He never asked for more than what Emma was willing to give. He never pushed for visits, never begged for more access. He simply wrote, offering parts of himself in careful doses, memories from his childhood, reflections from his prison cell, lessons he wished someone had taught him before it was too late. Emma had come to respect that restraint. It showed growth. It showed understanding of boundaries. And more than anything, it showed that he wasn't writing to be seen as a hero anymore. He was just trying to be present in the only way he still could. Time passed, and Emma found herself breathing easier. The bitterness that once coiled around her heart had loosened. She had built something strong from the ruins of betrayal, a home filled with warmth, a life grounded in authenticity, and a child who grew more brilliant with each passing day. She had never remarried, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't feel the urgency to. Her life was full. Her days were rich. She didn't need someone to complete her. She had completed herself. But there was a quiet companionship she missed sometimes. The kind of partnership that came not from extravagance, but from shared moments. Cooking dinner together, laughing over spilled juice, holding hands after a long day. Still, she wasn't lonely. She had chosen peace over chaos, truth over illusion. One afternoon, she found herself at the park, sitting on a bench while her son played with friends. The air was crisp, leaves tumbling from trees like confetti from a celebration only nature understood. A woman sat beside her and struck up casual conversation. She was kind, warm, with a similar energy to Emma's, quiet strength beneath a calm exterior. They spoke about their children, schools, the rising cost of groceries, and before long, laughter flowed easily between them. It was a reminder that the world was still open to connection, to joy, to friendship. Emma wasn't looking for love, but she was finally open to life again, not just surviving it, but living it. That evening, when her son asked about his father again, she smiled and handed him a fresh letter. "This one's about stars," she said. He opened it eagerly, and they read it together under a blanket, the lamp casting a soft glow around them. In prison, Adrian sat in the library alone, his hands ink-stained from yet another letter he had just finished. He stared out the small window, watching a bird flutter onto the ledge before flying away again. He didn't know how much longer he would be there. He didn't count the days anymore. He just wrote, read, listened, helped, and waited. A few other inmates had started asking him for advice, not legal, but life advice. One man asked how to start a letter to his estranged daughter. Another shared his own regrets, unsure how to make amends. Adrian never pretended to have answers. He just listened, shared what he could, and encouraged others to try, because trying, he now believed, was where real redemption began. One day, he received a package. Inside, a book written and illustrated by his son, a small, handmade project from school. It was titled My Dad and the Moon, and each page had drawings of a father and son sending messages through the stars, waving at each other from opposite ends of the sky. Adrian turned each page slowly, his heart unraveling with every scribbled sentence. He cried quietly in his cell, not from sorrow, but from a strange, overwhelming gratitude. He had once stood at the top of the world, surrounded by flashing lights and adoration, but he had never felt more seen than he did in that moment, holding a child's book in his hands. Emma watched from afar, never speaking of these gestures to anyone, never boasting. She simply continued building her life, knowing that her strength had shaped not just her survival, but her son's future. And while she didn't forget what Adrian had done, she also didn't let it define what he had become. Redemption, she had come to believe, was not a destination. It was a journey walked quietly, step by step, with humility and grace. As her son grew older, their home remained filled with laughter and stories, with dreams and discoveries. And every so often, she'd catch him sitting at the table, writing another letter to his father, asking new questions, sharing new stories, bridging the gap between two lives shaped by very different paths, but now stitched together by choice, not obligation. And in that quiet harmony, in that delicate balance of forgiveness and growth, a new beginning bloomed. One built not on glamour, but on loyalty. Not on wealth, but on truth. Not on perfection, but on effort. And that, perhaps, was the most extraordinary success story of all. The walls of the prison no longer intimidated Adrian the way they once did. With time, they had become something else, constant, heavy, but no longer suffocating. Routine dulled their edges. He had memorized the sound of the morning bell, the smell of cheap soap, the way his cell door creaked slightly every time it opened. The physical discomfort no longer mattered. What remained sharp, however, was the contrast between who he used to be and who he was now. The man who once sat at the top of boardrooms now sat on a metal stool during group sessions, listening as other men recounted their regrets, their broken relationships, their stolen years. Some had committed far worse crimes. Some hadn't. But in that room, they were equal, just voices trying to make sense of the choices that had taken everything from them. And Adrian, despite his tailored past, was no exception. He often wondered how he had become that man, the one who walked away from loyalty in pursuit of glitter. Not real gold, not solid worth, just glitter, bright, eye-catching, weightless. He remembered the way people used to look at him when he entered a room. Wide smiles, eager handshakes, whispers of admiration. He had mistaken those for love, for respect. He had fed off it like a drug, and when it ran out, he had tried to buy more with bigger headlines, flashier partners, riskier decisions. He hadn't realized how fragile it all was until it shattered beneath him. And now, when he stared at the cold walls, he could only shake his head at how easily he'd traded depth for surface, permanence for attention, family for applause. Sometimes, on the rare nights when sleep came easily, Adrian dreamed of the life he might have had. In those dreams, There were no prison walls, no reporters, no indictment. There was just a small house, a backyard, a child's laughter echoing through open windows. He dreamed of holding his son's hand while walking through a bookstore, of standing beside Emma while decorating a Christmas tree, of being someone who earned love, not bought it, not performed for it, but deserved it. He always woke from those dreams with a bittersweet ache in his chest, half comforted, half hollowed out. But he never stopped dreaming, because even now, he believed that dreaming was the only part of him they hadn't taken away. As his parole hearing approached, Adrian felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Not of rejection, not of continued confinement, but of the unknown. What if he was released? What would that even look like? Where would he go? Who would he be? The outside world had changed. People had moved on. Emma had built a new life. His son was growing fast, forming his own identity, his own story. Adrian didn't know if he would still have a place in any of it. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all, that sometimes redemption doesn't come with reunion. Sometimes it comes with acceptance that you're no longer needed the way you once hoped to be. Still, when the day came, he stood before the parole board with quiet humility. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't prepare a speech. He simply spoke. He talked about his crimes, his failures, his regrets. He didn't paint himself as a victim or a changed man. He didn't try to convince anyone. He just told the truth. He spoke of the nights he spent staring at a child's drawing, of the letters he wrote, of the friendships he had formed inside these walls, not based on status or profit, but on vulnerability. He spoke of Emma, not in an attempt to draw sympathy, but as a tribute to the woman who had shown grace when he had offered nothing but betrayal. And when the board deliberated, he sat quietly, hands folded, prepared for whatever decision would come. They granted his parole. When the news was delivered, he didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He simply nodded, thanked them, and walked back to his cell with slow, steady steps. That night, he packed the few belongings he had accumulated over the years, a few books, his letters, the worn crayon drawing. He didn't sleep. He just sat on his bed, watching the final hours pass like water through his fingers. He didn't know what awaited him beyond those walls, but he knew what he would leave behind: his arrogance, his illusions, the weight of pretending to be someone he wasn't. And for the first time in years, he felt light. His release was quiet. No cameras, no reporters, no scandals. Just a gate that opened, a guard who nodded, and a sky that looked wider than he remembered. He didn't go straight to Emma. He didn't go to his old properties or former colleagues. He rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, started working at a local bookstore through a rehabilitation program. He shelved novels, cleaned windows, unpacked deliveries. The same man who once oversaw billion-dollar transactions now spent hours placing paperbacks in alphabetical order. And yet, he found peace in it. There was something sacred in simplicity, something he had forgotten long ago. He wrote to his son again, this time sending a real photo of himself in his new life. Not behind a podium, not in a suit, but in a plain t-shirt, holding a copy of his favorite childhood book. He enclosed a note. I don't know where this road will lead, but I'm walking it with both feet on the ground now. If you ever want to walk beside me, I'll be here. He didn't expect a reply. He only hoped. Weeks later, he received one. A short note written in uneven letters. I like your bookstore. Mom said maybe we can visit sometime. Can I help you put the books on the shelves? Adrian sat in silence, tears slipping down his cheeks. Not from sorrow this time, but from something softer, something more profound. He folded the letter and placed it next to the drawing he still carried everywhere. That weekend, Emma and their son visited. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand reunions, no emotional declarations. Just a small boy running down an aisle between the mystery and science fiction sections, his eyes wide with excitement. Adrian knelt, arms open but cautious, unsure what would happen. The boy hugged him, briefly, but it was real. Emma smiled from a distance, nodding slightly. Adrian stood, walked toward her, and said only one thing. Thank you for giving him this choice. She looked at him, calm and steady. He's not the only one who had a choice, Adrian. You did too. And you finally made the right one. They spent the afternoon sorting books together, laughing at old titles, reading short stories aloud. It wasn't a full circle. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was something better. It was real. And in that quiet space, surrounded by pages and second chances, Adrian Blake finally understood what freedom truly meant. Not wealth, not applause, not escape, but accountability, presence, redemption, and he would spend the rest of his life honoring the cost it took to learn that truth.